Thank you very much, Niall. Welcome everyone. Today's talk is going to be on science fiction, as has been said, particularly in relation to capital, fictions, and worlds to come, drawing on, of course, Fisher's question of what's next, and also the effect that fictions have on the real. Just a sec. Sorry, I'm experiencing some technical difficulties already. For whatever reason, and okay, so yeah, that was just intro stuff. Okay, so to begin with a quote from Catherine Malibu. What should we do so that the consciousness of a brain does not coincide with the spirit of capitalism? I chose to begin with this quote because, to me, it touches on some of Fisher's work on science fiction and in regards to some of the other themes that we've looked at, namely embedded futures and thinking beyond the horizon of possibility offered to us by capitalism. In his 2010 essay, Terminator versus Avatar, Fisher critiques the effect of cyberpunk as well as his mentor, Nick Land, arguing that if Land's cyberfuturism can seem outdated, then it is not because it has been superseded by new futurisms, but rather that the future as such has succumbed to retrospection. This draws on the idea of the slow cancellation of the future, as in the future is a kind of commodity that capitalism is unable to deliver. Behind its procession of newness and innovation, we really see that it's a lot of the time more attempts at distributing, attempts to capture time and attention, and indeed bombard us with low-level stimuli. I included this this kind of meme to make a bit of a point. In 1999, there was the idea that there would be so many websites, and by 2019 we discover there are about 4, and they're all screenshots of the other 3, which is weird because this was a Twitter post that was sent to Tumblr and then posted to Reddit. So in a way, I promise this is relevant, it actually performs the very thing it sets out to criticize. Fisher describes this constant bombardment of low-level stimuli as a state of boredom and indeed high absorption in capitalism, but precisely its demand for participation is what neutralizes its otherwise our attempts to combat this negative feeling. So why is this the case? Well, capitalism generates empty time. It's incapable of seeing beyond the next financial quarter, and indeed it enacts fictions that actualize themselves as a way of controlling the present. Think of, say, when a piece of land is zoned, it's bought up and zoned to be developed for a block of flats, for an office space, or any kind of other project. Fisher describes the dynamics of capitalism as inherently science fictional, and as a kind of fiction that does not exist separately from the real, but actually has a kind of traction with it. It is a positive feedback loop, as his colleague Kodo Eshin talks about, between future-oriented media and capital. Utilizing devices like future shock absorbers, it attempts to preserve the longevity of capitalism and re-establish its horizons. Samuel Delaney notes, capital as a fiction involves a massive distortion of the present, orienting it towards a certain future. As Fisher notes, Marx's exemplary definitions of capitalism as the cycle of MC(M) prime implies a future exchange, and precisely the abstraction of time into homogeneous abstract labor time for commodity production. And this is all the more the case in cycles of financialization, which is expressed in the cycle M to M prime. The kind of price that we pay for increasingly rapid production turnovers is a sense of cultural stagnation. We can see this because I'm surprised Terminator Dark Fate was allowed to get made, because it's almost a perfect meta-reflexive commentary on our inability to imagine a future. And it's like in and I'm surprised it got past the censors. So Fisher argues that Fisher argues that capital is, in a sense, hyperstitional, that is, a fiction that makes itself real, one that persists as a virtuality but becomes actualized through different kinds of practice. He uses the example of the Terminator in the first two Terminator movies, distributing components in the past in order to accelerate its advent in the present and to pre-program the future for its advent. Whereas in this case with Terminator Dark Fate, and the film appears to demonstrate our infatuation with, or indeed compensatory need, for old ways of making the future appear. Skynet in the movie, spoilers, is defeated, but an identical evil AI, Legion, takes its place, as if capital as Mega Death Drive as Terminator was an ontological constant. And also, the Terminator itself in Dark Fate is simply a fusion of older models, and liquid metal over a metal endoskeleton, and the plot beats repeat themselves as well. So again, I'm very much surprised this got made. This is because, as Anna Greenspan described, and capitalism creates a kind of transcendental time machine in which our experience of time is equated with the various dynamics of capital. Timekeeping devices such as clocks, in particular town and factory clocks, created whole new regimes of thinking about time that had previously been tied to extra-human factors. But indeed, all this really served to do was cocoon us within a very narrow bandwidth of time itself. I really hope that you can all read the green text. I probably should have filled in the back on this. According to speculative realist philosopher Quentin Meilloassoux, this is a problem of correlationism, in which we only have access to the correlate of thought and being. However, in this sense, this correlation is explicitly temporal. And Fisher argues that there is another way in which capitalist realism is science fictional, in the sense that its life world is inherently self-estranging, and he uses Ursula Le Guin's The Lathe of Heaven as an example of this, precisely to demonstrate how the perpetual present that capitalism generates is always accessible to revision. And he felt it, the shift, the arrival, the change. The woman felt it too. She looked frightened, holding the brass necklace up to her throat close like a talisman. She was staring in dismay, shock, terror, out the window at the view. And what would it do to the woman? Would she understand? Would she go mad? What would she do? Would she keep both memories as he did? The true one and the new one? The old one and the true one? And so that kind of a final line really serves to to illustrate how quickly these things can be changed so readily. So how exactly do we try and get beyond this? Is there a way out of this transcendental time machine? Well, in some cases, yes, and this is where Fisher brings into play science fiction. In Ghosts of My Life, Fisher argues that although desolate, the popular culture of his time afforded traces of futurity. And what is a trace? Well, just as there are traces of the past in the present, and there are traces of the future in the present, certain objects or patterns which might point towards a certain future. We might think of it along Jacques Derrida's lines of the no longer versus the not yet. And in a sense, Fisher argues we are haunted by these unactualized future potentials. These future traces were expanded upon by cultural theorists such as Raymond Williams, Frederick Jameson, and Stephen Shaviro, the latter of whom arguing that science fiction can provide a psychosocial technological cartography of the present, examining it in the light of a different future through cognitive and affective mapping. Raymond Williams, of course, offers this neat little matrix of different forms of different fictional devices for writing both science fiction and utopia. There's the positing of a paradise or hell, the externally altered world, and of course the willed and technological transformations. As a Marxist who was interested in agency, Williams was particularly interested in these last two ones. Science fiction enables the creation of new technologies that themselves enable such transformations or may stand in for them in fiction. Then the technological changes can offer a new mode or concept or passage of political revolution, such as H.G. Wells's eponymous Time Machine or the narrator of William Morris's utopia News from Nowhere, going to sleep and finding himself miraculously transported into the new society. Given his own taste for inventing new political concepts and improvisations, we might actually say that Lenin was a kind of science fiction writer in real terms. However, then a paradox arises, which might be known as Jamesons Paradox. How to actually actualize these future traces, how to combine the not yet being of the present, how to combine the not yet being of the future with the being of the present, and can we imagine something that is outside of our own experience of time? In short, how do we get there from here? There's a bit of a joke about this, like where someone once asked the way to the railway station, the response they got was, well, it wouldn't start from here. The irony being, of course, there's nowhere else to start from. So how can we get beyond this? And also, how can we get beyond the temporal correlate that we find ourselves in? Speculative realist philosopher Quentin Meilloassoux combines this paradox of trying to write the future from the present with that of trying to think an outside to subjective experience, which is also something that we've seen in Fisher's work time and again, particularly in his references to the Lacanian real and indeed to Immanuel Kant's thing in itself. As such, we can relocate the outside and thus the future, not temporally, but ontologically. As Simon O'Sullivan, Fisher's colleague, argues, the outside may also be the future when understood not singularly as extension and repetition of existing knowledge, and not a place as such, but rather as radical contingency in itself, a sense that anything can happen. Like Jameson's future trace, this radical contingency is within our world and beckons us to the outside. This specifically, Meilloassoux uses what he calls the arc fossil or arch fossil, something that through the use of scientific deduction points towards a point at which there was no human consciousness, and indeed the radical contingency that this entails. And however, there's a catch here as well. It raises questions for science fiction narrative. And if this future or outside rules, is there a fundamental risk of narrative rupture? If science fiction is a kind of space anthropology, Williams' term, then how do we contain this outside? Can fictions have an effect on the real world without just being part of it? Fisher argues that genre fiction has a unique ability here to formulate new kinds of syntax, futural forms, and to, as in his views on popular modernism. They might still be readable, but it's a narrative that nonetheless is difficult to imagine, and so it folds it into sensory experience. So this is a kind of way of overcoming Jameson's paradox. Drawing on Meilloassoux once again and his concept of extro science fiction, and worlds which are chaotic and so difficult to narrate, and Fisher's colleague Simon O'Sullivan argues there can be a category of X science fiction to designate a further break with the linearity of narrative, of syntax, and of science. The most interesting, of course, would be Type 2 worlds, where there is a consistency, but not as we know it, to risk a Star Trek comparison. And doing so, argues Stephen Shaviro, allows us deeper insight into things as they are, and things in themselves, challenging the predominant anthropocentric and cognitivist view that we only really have access to knowledge on the insides of our on the insides of our skulls, answering metaphysical questions as to the nature of qualia via a speculative extrapolative framework. And he argues that, well, the key to this is to do so via a different future. Fisher takes a slightly different approach, however, seeing a congruity between Darko Suvin's definition of science fiction as a fiction involving the dialectic of estrangement and cognition, cognitive estrangement, and how this plays out within an imaginative framework that is alternate to the life world of its author, and Baruch Spinoza's brand of psychedelic reason, which Fisher often wrote about. Specifically, as Spinoza has a tendency to entify everything, assigning it a cause in nature or God, so too are these newly generated fictions, in a sense, ontologically real. Science fiction can thus engage in a radical dismantling of both the human ego and of the institutions that give rise to it, such as the kind of like late capitalist subjectivity that Matt seemed to talk about in his in his lecture on Wednesday. I'm very sorry. It does act as a kind of space probe sent through a wormhole and beaming us back alien signals. One key example of this is in these passages from Philip K. Dick, where he kind of goes Edgar Allan Poe's The Case of M. Valdemar, where the subject is able to survive its apparent dissolution. The Soviet composer Kongrosian wails as his own renegade psychic powers literally turn himself inside out, his biomassa and organs melding with the room around him. However, like at the same time as this, evident horror, oh God, where are my lungs? There's a kind of joy and fascination. He giggles helplessly. I can't hold myself, pick myself up. The organs and vital parts around me lying on the floor. Maybe I can stuff them back inside somehow. And then there's the very weirdly funny image of him, like, presumably, wagging his finger, like naughty naughty, at his own spleen. You're part of the I world, not the non-I, understand? And as a result of this, Fisher argues that the task of creating new forms is key to science fiction as a political and indeed ontological tool. Whether this syntax is the dread uncertainty of Philip K. Dick's fiction, the cut-up experimental novels of William Burroughs, or J.G. Ballard's Abolition of Time, Fisher admired science fictioning practices for their ability to make affects impersonal and thus more politically charged. These texts do not simply represent realities alternate to our own, they actually produce it, or to use the quote that Niall began this whole thing with, sorcerers don't create, they participate. And as such, it provides a way out of Kantian correlationism and its legislative edicts, as both the components, the science and the fiction part, allow for the production of new sensations and new modes of being. Mackenzie Walk argues that actual sciences, little by little, began working through an apparatus capable of registering sensations far beyond the scale and scope of the human, not just a way of objectively recording human senses, but of recording what the human subject can never sense. And so the solution to the paradox of science fiction, is to really see fiction less as ontologically separate than as something that is at work in the real, and thus has an effect on it. Fictions are the kinds of circuits and loops of time that the future, at least of a kind, already has in operation. For Fisher, these nested futures denaturalize our world, pointing out that outside, Meilloassoux's great outdoors, which is not to be thought of as a place nor within linear historical time. It is a break with historical time and actually performs this breakdown. As Fisher wrote of The Shadow over Innsmouth, we discover I am they. We discover the great outdoors is already indoors. As in the Hammer horror films, the call is coming from inside the house. Utilizing the hauntological no longer and not yet simultaneously, we may reactivate the potentials hidden in popular culture, aiming towards a future outside of a limit propagated by capitalist time. So where exactly does this leave us? Well, science fiction, as Fisher conceived it, represents a kind of incursion of the outside into our thought space, pointing to a future and that capitalism can no longer deliver and no longer even promises to. Cultural inertia, stagnation, perpetual crisis, and a sense of being confined to our own heads are the correlates of rapidly quickening production cycles. And science fiction works with precisely the gap between the phenomenal and the noumenal, between content and form in its very dynamism. and thus it serves to incomplete, to poke holes in the business ontology of capital itself. And as Marx puts it, in the final limit on capitalism is capital itself, which is always chasing an impossible fantasy of boundless production beyond its own inertia. As with Fisher, science fiction and indeed the popular mobilization that we've seen the Black Lives Matter protests and recent calls to defund the police, and it can show us the door with an exit sign above it, as Philip K. Dick has written about in this beautiful passage from A Scanner Darkly, which is on the screen right now. And it's up to us to walk through it, however, and we can do this by both halting the slow cancellation of the future, by producing new fictions that we may live by, and indeed by reaching out beyond the other in solidarity. So finally, we have some just possible questions that we can hopefully use to invite discussion, such as what do you think of Fisher's use of science fiction as a critical tool? Do you find it convincing? Can you think of any science fiction or other examples of genre fiction that might do this? Do you think that this is a good argument or a good way to critique anthropocentrism? Can alternate futures be planned or designed, however? Well, also, do you know what other things do you think would be helpful in imagining alternatives and putting them into practice, as over the course of recent weeks we've learned that we need more than ever? Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ben. That was fantastic. Really, really good there. I think maybe I was going to say take a quick break, but first of all, I don't know if Liam, perhaps you want to sort of add anything to that or have some comments that you'd like to share?
Hello, always me with comments. Yeah, first of all, Ben, thank you for a really fascinating chat. I must admit, like sci-fi, I'm comfortable with. The philosophy there's blown my mind, and so you've given me lots of reading to do following this session. So thanks. Something I wanted to pick up on, I was sort of making notes of some of the things you were discussing, Ben, was the comment about science fiction dismantling the human ego and the institutions that give rise to it. And this sort of is making me think about, I think more the term institutions there, was making me think about Gerard Genet and his sort of notions of transtextuality, and make me think about that as much as science fiction or science fictions might challenge the institutions that are creating it, at the same time, all science fictions enter an architectural relationship with each other. And so by their very base of being science fiction, they are not dismantling that institution, but they are perpetuating it. Instead, they're perpetuating the genre of science fiction. And so I don't know where I'm going with that, because it's a half-formed thought, and I had to chase up some references whilst you were talking, but there's something there, maybe, I don't know. And at the end, you were talking about new fictions with which we can live by. And I've been doing a lot of reading recently on post-truth. And it just sort of made me think about that, how I think the notion of post-truth is something that we associate with fake news, for instance, but it's also just the idea of, if the population agrees on a certain thing or believes a certain thing, even if we have evidence to the contrary, that is in itself post-truth. And so maybe the idea that as much as we want to believe in and work towards better futures, alternate futures, we can't get there just by believing it. We need to actually make it happen. We need to do something to actually transform it, rather than just thinking it's been transformed. That's kind of me with my 2 cents. Yeah,